We are looking at the life of David on a Sunday evening, and last week we saw David and Jonathan trying to find out whether Saul was out to kill David. David was absent from the religious feast, and Saul got very angry about it. And he took it out on Jonathan, his son, calling him all sorts of nasty names for siding with David. When Jonathan refused to help Saul murder David, Saul threw a javelin at his son, but he escaped. Jonathan then told David that his life was in danger and that he should run away. So they parted from each other with great sadness and emotion. And David runs away, and Saul proclaims him a traitor. And from that time onwards, until Saul eventually dies, David is hunted as an outlaw. So that was a very difficult time for him, and his faith was put to a severe test, and we shall find out tonight that his faith was sometimes wanting. But in his affliction he wrote many of his psalms, and especially in this particular part of his life. For God brought good out of bad once more. It's rather like the epistles of Paul that were written in prison. You see, God knows that many of his people in every generation suffer affliction. So these things have been written in the Bible so as to prepare them for when that happens. David knew that the one thing he was going to miss more than anything else as he became a fugitive was the house of God. And so in the first verse of chapter 21 of 1 Samuel, he goes to the town of Nob where the tabernacle was so as to attend it just once more, not knowing how long it would be before he would be able to return and attend it again. He said goodbye to one friend, Jonathan. Now he was saying goodbye to another friend, the house of God. From the Psalms which David wrote, we can see that his greatest sadness during his banishment was his isolation from the house of God. He wrote such things as, "How amiable are thy tabernacles, O Lord of hosts! My soul longeth, even fainteth, for the courts of the Lord. For a day in thy courts is better than 1,000. I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness." How often it's not until we're not able to attend God's house that we realise how blessed it is to be there. For under normal circumstances we can take it for granted. Another reason why David went to the tabernacle was to inquire directions from the Lord through the high priest as to where he should go. Now he's on the run, what should he do? Where should he go? No Christian should be ambling along through life without the leading of the Lord. He must always be inquired of. Now we're told in this first verse that when he got there, Ahimelech the high priest was afraid to meet him. He had no doubt heard about the king's displeasure with David and probably realised that David was now on the run. And knowing what Saul was like, a man that would even kill his own son in anger, Ahimelech thinks twice before entertaining David. We know from what our Lord said in Mark's Gospel that David had a few young men with him, and the end of verse 2 here suggests that these young men were staying in a certain place nearby. As a military leader, David was used to being seen by others with many soldiers accompanying him, and that's probably why Ahimelech asked the question at the end of the verse, "Why art thou alone with no man with thee?" See, everybody wanted to be David's friend when he was on the way up, but now that he's on the way down, only a few faithful friends stood by him. How like today, where people seem to want you when you've got something to give them, but when you're down and you have little to offer them, people can forsake you. Wasn't it the same with the prodigal son? He had plenty of friends when he had money, but when his money had run out, his friends ran out. Speaking about this time in his life, David says in Psalm 102 that he was all alone like a sparrow on a housetop. See a little sparrow, tiny little bird on a housetop all alone? That's how David felt. If you think of David's life throughout, it was a series of ups and downs for him. He started off as a shepherd boy when nobody knew him, nobody wanted to know him. Then he conquered Goliath and became the king's son-in-law, and everybody was singing his praises. Then he became a fugitive and an outlaw, and nobody wanted to know him again. Then later he became the king and becomes very popular once more. Then after a time, when his son Absalom rebelled against him, he was on the run again, with some of his closest allies going over to Absalom. Then after Absalom is killed, David returns to his palace and things go well for him again. All this shows us the uncertainty of life, the fickleness of friends, and the necessity to realise that whatever situation we're in now, it can quite easily change either upwards or downwards. Now in verse 2, David sadly slips into telling deliberate lies again and doing it in God's house. How stupid this was. What's the point of trying to find out God's will for your life and asking him for directions if you're telling lies? For he says that Saul had sent him there, which is a complete travesty of the truth. If a man after God's own heart can stoop so low, then so can anybody else. And we have to pray that we don't tell lies. David, who had the courage to stand up against Goliath, is now afraid to speak the truth to the high priest. Rather like Elijah, another fine man of God. He wasn't afraid to stand up against those 400 false prophets, but he ran away from just one wicked woman. And perhaps this proves what we said last time about David's excuses about not attending the feast with Saul. That was a lie. David, like all men and women of God, had the problem of his flesh striving with his spirit. On most occasions he was governed by his spirit, but sometimes he gave way to the flesh. He'd found it much easier to stay near the Lord when he'd been a shepherd boy. In those days he had great faith, and he was able to get victories over the lion and the bear and then Goliath. But since then, in the king's palace, he found it more difficult to live by faith. And when his life was in great danger, he began to give way to his flesh and started looking at his enemies instead of looking at the Lord. So David was going through one of those bad patches that Christians often go through, where their troubles seem in their eyes to be getting bigger and the Lord's power seems to be getting smaller. David's faith had gradually turned to fear, and his fear began to make him tell lies. And if this could happen to him, it could happen to us. It was the same with Peter in the New Testament, wasn't it? There was a time when he had such great faith that he was able to walk on water. But later on his faith turned to fear, so that when a young girl claimed that he'd been with Christ, he said that wasn't true and he didn't even know him. Well does the scriptures warn us, he that thinketh that he standeth, take heed lest he fall. Maybe David had even begun to doubt that he would be the next king. After all, God hadn't stopped Saul from persecuting him. Why did the evil man get away with it, whilst David, who had right on his side, seemed to have lost out by it? And so David told these lies. And he not only said that it was on the king's business, but he was told that the king told him to keep quiet about it. Now, he didn't know at the time, one of the saddest things in the whole life of David, that 85 priests and their families would later be murdered because he told these lies. And that must have haunted David for the rest of his life. Indeed, we're told in the next chapter that David was later to say to Ahimelech's son, I have occasioned the death of all these persons of thy father's house. And this shows us the solemn truth that an awful lot of people can stand to lose a great deal by a Christian telling lies. If David had told the truth to Ahimelech, the probability was that the priest would have helped him anyway and been better able to pray for his guidance. How we need to pray often, Lord, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil, even from ourselves doing evil. In verse 3, David asked Ahimelech what was under his hand. In other words, what food had he got? For David and his men were now very hungry, and he wanted 5 loaves. At the door of the tabernacle there would have been the 12 loaves on the golden table, which was called the showbread. This special bread belonged to the priests and their families. but these loaves could have been standing there for a few days. How much David's circumstances had changed. Once he'd been feeding on the luxuries in the king's palace, now he's pleading for bread. And this must throw some light on that well-known verse in Psalm 37, a verse that is precious to me, about the righteous never having been forsaken, nor his seed ever seen begging bread. But here is David himself begging for bread. How do you put it together? What does it mean? It must mean that the righteous are very seldom begging for bread, although it may happen on a rare occasion, as was the case here. And in the same way, the Christian may know times of being hard up, but that won't be the norm. And it should also be noticed that David was begging for bread in God's house. He never begged for anything from the ungodly. Ahimelech tells David in verse 4 that this is only the hallowed bread, the special bread, the show bread. That's available, he says, but there's no ordinary bread. David and his friends were welcome to this special bread, provided they kept themselves away from women. See, Moses had commanded this in Exodus, just before giving the 10 Commandments. And it signified that a man must give his full attention to what God has got to say and not let his mind be diverted by his interest in a woman. But why Ahimelech applied this old requirement to the situation that David and his friends were in is not clear. But anyway, the men had not been near any women, not for 3 days, says David, and therefore they were entitled to have the showbread. And David further points out that the bodies of these men were holy as they belonged to God, and therefore their bodies would sanctify the food. In the New Testament, our Lord Jesus vindicated David's action when the Pharisees criticised him for letting his disciples pluck the wheat on the Sabbath day. You see, religious observances are important, and so are the bodies of men and women. So a real necessity can overrule religious observance. For example, attending church is a good thing to do, but if a person is sick, then it would be right for them to stay away. And so in verse 6, Ahimelech gives David 5 loaves, keeping only 7 back for the priests and their families, trusting that God would make it up to them. But very sadly, we're told in verse 7 that one of Saul's servants, a man by the name of Doeg, was there, and we're told that he was an Edomite, and the Edomites were the enemies of the Jews. But in order to gain advancement in Saul's court, Doeg had outwardly changed his religion and accepted the Jewish faith. It says here that he was detained before the Lord for some reason, we don't know what it is, but Ahimelech kept him at the tabernacle. Perhaps he'd been polluted in some way. Maybe he had to be purified, or perhaps he had to pay some vow. But whatever it was, Doeg seems to be annoyed about it and found the whole thing wearisome. It seems very foolish indeed for David to have spoken to the priest in the presence of Doeg. But then when a man takes his eyes off the Lord and starts telling lies, common sense goes by the board. And he may act even more foolishly than a man of the world. But despite all the psalms that he'd written, David is extremely unwise at this point and lets his guard down and makes a giant mistake. Christians must always be careful when they're having a discussion with another Christian if an unbeliever is present with them, realizing that their words can be twisted and later used against the cause of Christ. Now in verse 8, David asks Ahimelech for a sword. But the priests didn't have swords, they were men of peace. The weapons of their warfare was not carnal. The only sword that was available was Goliath's sword, which had been kept in the tabernacle as a monument of God's goodness and greatness in delivering Israel from Goliath. David himself had taken that sword off Goliath and placed it in the tabernacle. Now, once again, people are disagreed as to whether David did right in asking for Goliath's sword. Those who think that he was right point to the fact that he'd actually use that sword to cut off Goliath's head, and therefore when he would use it in the future, it might help him to have extra faith. He would remember that in the strength of God he was able to overcome a great enemy. And again, if David was right in asking for the sword, it would show another truth, that that which you give to God through his church will eventually come back to you. You see, it was David who gave this sword to the tabernacle in the first place, not realising then how he would need it himself one day. And when that day came, he was given it back by the church. But those who feel that David did wrong in asking for the sword, they point out what he said himself when he came to fight Goliath. Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Can you see the point of that? In the past, David did not put his trust in carnal weapons, but in the Lord. And he was able to defeat Goliath, what with? A little pebble stone. And he took that sword from Goliath to show how worthless it was, that it wasn't able to win the battle. But now David's in a backslidden state, and he puts his confidence in the very weapon that had failed Goliath. It's always a sure sign of somebody backsliding when they turn back to those things that they once gave up for Christ. It should also be pointed out that the very same time that David asked for this sword, he told yet another lie. At the end of verse 8, he says that the reason why he had no sword was because he was on the king's business, and this had to be done hastily. Well, of course, that was totally untrue, and it doesn't show David in the best light. But as we've said before, although we would never condone people speaking lies, there is no telling what we ourselves might be capable of if we were in a life and death situation. And so Ahimelech the priest allows David to have Goliath's sword, which had been wrapped up in a cloth to look after it. And as it was unwrapped, David said, "There's none like that," as if to say, no other sword compares with that. And so he takes the sword of the Philistine, and then, believe it or not, he goes to the land of the Philistines. Isn't that amazing? And amazingly, he goes to Gath, the very city where Goliath came from. When he trusted in the God of Israel, he was found in Israel. But now he's trusting in the sword of the Philistines. He's found in the land of the Philistines. What possessed him to go there is uncertain. He'd killed many Philistines. He'd killed hundreds, perhaps thousands of Philistines. Surely he was much more in danger there than in Israel. But it pictures the fact that when a Christian is trusting in the Lord, they will be found amongst the Lord's people. But when they start trusting in money and materialism and so on, you can begin to see them drifting away to be with the world's people. Anyway, David went to see Achish, the king of Gath. Jewish history states that Goliath and Achish, who were both from Gath, had been adversaries to each other, and that Achish was glad when Goliath was slain, and that's why David went to see him. Whether there's any truth in that or not, or whether that's the only explanation that people can think of for such a foolish decision, is not clear. It could well be the case that David had tried to disguise himself and pretend that he was somebody else, but he was soon discovered in verse 11 when the servants of Achish tell him who David really was. Wasn't this the man who the Israelite women sang a song about, they say, because he'd killed so many Philistines? Saul had slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. When a Christian backslides and goes back into the world, they cannot easily settle down with the ungodly, for their Christian past will somehow be recognised and will be spoken about by the unbelievers who they now want to be friends with. When David heard what the servants had said, we're told he was sore afraid that Achish would now put him to death. Those women had written that song with the best of intentions, but this was now the second time that David had lost out by it. It was when it was first sung that Saul got jealous of David and started turning against him. And it shows that it's often not a good thing for people to sing your praises. The servants state that David was the king of Israel, which was wrong, but Achish knew better. He knew that Saul was the king and that he was against David, and therefore David might prove to be of some help to the Philistines. In Psalm 118, David says, "It's better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in princes." And how that was true now in his own situation. His confidence in this prince, Achish, was soon shaken, and he's terrified. He also wrote Psalm 56 at this very time, and the title of Psalm 56 says it was on this occasion. And in that psalm he says, "What time I was afraid, I will trust in thee. I will not be afraid of what man should do unto me. Only by hoping in God could he hope to overcome his great fear at that time." Despite the truth which he wrote down, his fear still seems to get the better of him, and in the end he gave way to pretending that he was mad. And by doing this he hoped that the Philistines would feel sorry for him, or at least feel that he was no threat to them, and therefore they wouldn't kill him. Perhaps they would believe that David had been driven mad because of all that Saul had done against him. Now perhaps you feel that David was clever in doing this and that he was simply trying to save his life. On the other hand, you may feel that a man of God chosen to be the king was dishonouring himself and dishonouring God to behave like that, to be a madman. We're told that he was scratching at the doors and letting his spittle fall down his beard as though he'd lost control of himself. However, you see, it doesn't seem to have affected things, but he did get away from the Philistines. And in verse 14, King Achish says to his servants, "Look, this man is mad," as if to say he can't be any threat to us. Why should I want a madman? You don't have to worry about me employing David or using him. I don't want an idiot like that in my house. Neither should you worry about him. Don't think of putting him to death. Just let him go away. It's just a madman. And that's what happened. And David escaped. And it would seem as though his scheme had worked. But the question must be asked, why didn't they kill him? Whether he was mad or not, because he'd killed so many Philistines, why didn't they take the advantage of killing him? It was only God's protecting hand that saved David. Through his backsliding, he'd put himself in a very dangerous position, but the Lord remained faithful to him and was determined to fulfill his promises to him, and he would yet become the next king. So that's why David was delivered. And it's the same with backsliders today. They can put themselves in a dangerous situation where they're going to heap a lot of trouble for themselves, but as the Lord has truly saved them and promised to keep them and promised to take them to heaven when they die, he will deliver them out of the troubles that they put themselves in and fulfill his promises to them. When you think of the lovely Psalms that David wrote and how often he said that he was putting his trust in the Lord, we have to be disappointed tonight, to say the least, in what we've seen about him. We've certainly seen that even the best of Christians are not beyond behaving foolishly and doing wrong. May what we've looked at tonight be a warning to us to trust God fully and not stoop to telling half-truths and behaving foolishly. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart and lean not to thine own understanding. Amen.